Well, thank you everybody for coming along this evening. My name's Siobhan MacDonald. I work for SAC, but this webinar is held on behalf of the Farm Advisory Service. And we are delighted to have with us this evening Audrey Litterick from Audrey Litterick Consulting. And Audrey used to work for SAC and is definitely an expert in all things soil and is a specialist at the moment, having moved on to another company that specialises in soil.
Okay, thanks, Siobhan. Yes, people have got the idea that soil health is about a bit more generally just than the living things in the soil, just a bit more than that. So what we're going to cover today, Siobhan, this is Norman Stephen digging a hole. He's taught me a lot about how to assess soil health over the years, and I'm still assessing soil health on a regular basis. There's nothing quite like getting out into the field to look at soil health, and it's something I much prefer to do than sit and talk about it in a classroom situation. However, we'll see how far we can get here tonight. So I'm going to define soil health. I'm also going to talk a bit about the soil health crisis, because I'm afraid to say there is one. We're going to look at key aspects of soil health, physical, chemical and biological aspects of soil health. Then I'm going to look at how you can assess and measure the health of your soil. And then last of all, I'm going to talk about how we can create and maintain healthy soils. So soil is so much more than just dirt. And I think there's no need to convince all the people sitting in this virtual room of that. Soil should be full of life and full of function. So one of the best, I've slightly altered this definition of soil health because as an academic, the definitions can be a bit over wordy. So basically what we're talking about is with soil health is the capacity of soil to function as a vital living system. And some of the people were saying that in the chat, which is absolutely right. So soil is a vital living system. It's almost like an organism, but it's crammed full of many organisms. So it's more of an ecosystem, really. It's a vital living system to sustain plant and animal productivity, so plant growth, animal production, if you like, but also it's got other services. So it's got ecosystem services, and those can only be fulfilled by healthy soil. So to maintain and enhance water quality, the waters that land on soil and pass through it, and also air quality above the soils as well. And also a healthy soil will promote plant and animal health. It's so important. Without health in the soil, the crops won't yield well. And natural ecosystems will not thrive. And we'll see more pests, more diseases, and as soil health declines, we see increasing amounts of practical and environmental problems too. And unfortunately, we are seeing that. Soil health is beginning to turn around, and more people are talking about it. And importantly, big scale guys, large scale farmers are getting more and more excited about it. When I started working in soil health, originally it'd be about 20 years ago. And when you started talking to farmers about soil health, they turned off. Not the organic farmers that I was mainly involved with, but conventional farmers were not really, you could organize a whole meeting on soil health and soil health measurement and management, and nobody would turn up. Whereas nowadays, that's very different. Unfortunately, in the UK, we've got a soil health crisis. Now, this is much more the case in cultivated soils. It's much less the case in permanent grass, for example, or in mixed systems where you've got livestock and crops in the same place. It's much less in typical organic systems, but soil health can be pretty poor in stockless organic rotations too. So we've got clear evidence that soil health is declining in many cultivated soils in the UK. And here's an example of a horribly compact clay loam soil in an arable rotation that's got vegetable crops in it. So this is real life, as bad as it can be sometimes. So what we're seeing much lower soil organic matter contents than we should be seeing in some cultivated soils. We're seeing some very poor structure, some terrible compaction. We're also seeing very low levels of biological activity. Now, this is not the case across the board, but we are seeing it quite widely. Soils with poor resilience to a range of stresses. And what we are now seeing is more stresses than ever before because our climate is changing. So we're seeing more wind erosion, particularly in the lighter soils, more water erosion, decreased porosity. That means that water does not flow through soils as fast as it should be doing. So we're seeing more flooding and more ponding. And my goodness, I've seen a lot of that in the last 3 months. Increased pest and disease problems because the crops are struggling a bit in poorly structured soils, poorer crop yields, and inconsistency in crop performance, where the poorest crop performance quite often is happening in the very, very wet spells or the very dry spells. And we're seeing more of both of those. So we're seeing weather extremes. So our soils have been on a nosedive in terms of health for probably several decades, but it's the increases in I suppose hot weather, increased extreme weather events are highlighting the problems that we have with soil health. And some farmers are finding because their soils are heavier, they're more compacted, they're needing bigger tractors in order to work with them. These photographs, the next 3 photographs I'm going to show you are all Scottish soils. And they're all arable rotations with vegetable crops in them on a bigger scale. We're not talking small scale horticulture growers here, and there's a reason for that, which I'll go into in a minute. So we're seeing more serious water erosion, and this is taken fairly near where I live on in Strathtay, the banks of the Tay. Absolutely appalling water problems here. A great deal of water has fallen and it's got nowhere to go at the moment. When things get this bad, there's no quick and easy solution. So why has soil health declined on so many farms? Too much cultivation too often. When you're using power harrows and rotavators, they're smashing up soil aggregates. They're disrupting fungal hyphae, tearing them to bits, basically. So too much cultivation too often is not a good thing. Lack of organic matter returns to the soil. So when I started out in my career, people just did not talk about this. They talked about synthetic fertilizers being a good thing. And of course, after the Second World War, they largely were, because they got their country's food production systems back up on their feet again. But synthetic fertilizers do not feed the soil microorganisms and the soil fauna like earthworms and collembolans and mites and tardigrades and so on. They don't feed those. And if microorganisms don't have any food, and these organisms, larger ones, don't have any food, they die, and then they can't function properly within their role in the soil. The other thing is many farms now have no livestock. We're seeing increased specialisation of farms, and when there are no livestock, there's no manure returns being made to the soil either. And of course, we're now using less pesticides than we were a decade ago, because regenerative farming has really taken off. But pesticides and veterinary medicines have taken a pretty heavy toll, really, on some of the organisms that live in our soils. The other thing is monocropping is a bad thing. I'm not talking about grass, which can be very, very healthy, but where cereals are grown year on year on year, not a good thing. And some high value crops like root crops like carrots and turnips and potatoes are often harvested a bit late, sometimes in winter when soil conditions can be very wet. And of course, these root crops also need a great deal of very, very invasive cultivations. So the two are a bit of a perfect storm can be created. And as I said, we're seeing longer periods of sustained wet weather, heavier rainfall events, and greater annual rainfall totals. But as I said, I don't have many pictures of really awful soil health on small scale growers' places. And there's a reason for that. The picture tends to be much rosier. You're starting from a higher benchmark, if you like, or a higher baseline of soil health. Why is this? Well, smaller growers tend to favour using bulky organic materials such as dungs and composts over synthetic fertilisers. And as I've said, these feed the soil organisms. The big ones, like earthworms, and the smaller ones right down to microorganisms. Smaller growers tend to be already very aware of soil health, and many of them want to use fewer pesticides and fewer veterinary medicines. So they're using prevention methods to control both livestock diseases and things like worms as well, and also crop pests and diseases. Smaller growers also tend to grow a wider range of crops, and that's very good for soil health too. And many crofters and small-scale growers have got animals on their farm, so they've got a ready source of dung and other organic materials that can be applied to land. So let's talk about health of soils in a bit more detail. We're not just talking about the biology, because the biology will not thrive unless the chemistry and the physics are right. So you've got to think about all three things. You've got to be thinking about the physical properties and the chemical properties, and getting those two things right, or those two groups of things right, if you like, in order for the biology to thrive. So that's why I'll be talking about all three things. So I want to have a look in a bit more detail at some key properties. So we would be, I'm just going to go back a little bit. Yeah, to this slide here. By physical properties, I'm talking about soil texture, which is a defining property. You can't change that. I'll say more about that in a minute. Soil structure, which is absolutely key. So I will be talking about that. Bulk density, that means the weight that a soil has in a given volume. So a healthy soil should maybe only be about 1.3 kilograms perhaps per litre. And the rest is air and water. But a very compact, unhealthy soil might be right up to 2 kilograms per litre. So, and some of the very, very heavy soils in land restoration that I work with, former open cast soils, they'll be 2, but they're very, very unhealthy, poorly developed soils. So, and infiltration, there's another very important physical property. That's the speed at which water will move through a soil. But that, again, is dependent on soil structure. So that's why I'm going to talk about soil texture and structure in a minute. Chemical properties, I'm not going to focus on this in a big way. And some people in the chat were saying that we're not really mentioning chemistry, but soil chemistry is very, very important. So by that, I mean pH, which has a massive effect on the kind of organisms that can actually live in your soils. So pH is very important. That's the amount of acidity, if you like, that's in the soil, and that affects nutrient availability to plants massively. Also, organic matter content, I'm counting that as a chemical property, and that's very, very important. If I was to pick one property, probably that would help to define soil health, which I don't want to do, but if I was forced down that route, it would be soil organic matter content. So I'll mention that in a bit more detail as well. Other things that are important with the chemistry are presence of pesticides. Obviously, that can make a soil very unhealthy, and someone who's put year after year after year of, say, residual herbicides on a soil, that soil will be pretty much dead if it's had a lot of pesticide on it. So those are not nice properties, but they sometimes are worth testing for, or other contaminants. Biological properties, that's obviously very, very important in terms of soil health, and there's various things you can measure. So I will be going on to talk in more detail about several aspects of those. In particular, I'm going to have a look at soil texture, which we cannot change, soil structure, which we can, soil organic matter, and also the life in our soils. So soil texture, as I've said, you're kind of stuck with that. You can't do anything with it generally. On a small scale, like in a polytunnel, you might be able to, but on a larger scale, no, you're stuck with it. Soil structure, however, very much can be changed. So soil texture and structure, those two words are quite often mixed up and used wrongly, so it's really important to understand the difference. So soil texture is the relative proportions of sand, silt, and clay. So sandy soils tend to be quite light, don't have much of a structure. Water should infiltrate through them quite quickly, but they're very prone to wind erosion. Silty soils can be prone to structural collapse in heavy rain, but they can also be very fertile, sometimes very deep. Clay soils can be extremely fertile, but sometimes a bit heavy and difficult to work, and sometimes quite too water retentive. But you can't change all those things. Stones and gravel can also change the properties associated with particular textures. So soil texture influences how easily a soil drains, how easily the soil cultivates. Its tendency to compact also influences what you might grow. So light sandy soils are great for carrots, and maybe deeper, more fertile soils are better for other crops. So it depends on the crop, really. Available water holding capacity, that's affected by texture. Extent to which nutrients are retained. So a sandy soil will hold very few, whereas a heavier soil like a clay soil will hold more nutrients. And similarly, lime. You have to tend to lime little and often in a light soil, and you can put on bigger amounts and it will be longer lasting in a heavier soil. And you can measure soil texture is fixed, as I said. It's very important to know what you've got. So you can do it by hand if you learn how to do it, or somebody can help you do that through hand texturing. I won't go into how to do that tonight because that would take me probably 10 minutes to do it properly. Experts can do it quickly by hand in the field, or you can send your soils off for lab testing and you can get a figure back from the lab. The other thing that is worth doing, and all of you really should do this, is go onto the Scotland's Soils website. That's all you need to do, is look up Scotland's soils. And there's a fantastic website there hosted by the James Hutton Institute. And they will tell you, they'll give you the soil map for your precise area. And you can see what you're likely to have in terms of the soil type and the land capability for that soil, how good it is to be growing certain types of crop, for example. What you can change and what does change for better or for worse is soil structure. And that's the way in which sand, silt and clay and humus particles, organic particles, combine to form aggregates. And by forming little lumps, fairly stable little lumps, tiny, tiny lumps, and then larger lumps as well, these aggregates clump together and they create pores and channels for water and air to move through. And this is what you can smash to pieces with a rotavator. This is what you can smash to pieces by overcultivation. And this is why permaculture people advocate no dig, or pretty much no dig at all. It doesn't always work that in the context where you're looking for maximum yield of root crops, but you should be aiming towards minimizing your cultivations. Good soil structure is absolutely vital for healthy soils and healthy crops. So a little bit more about structure. In a well-structured topsoil, pores make up as much as 50 to 60% of a soil's volume. That's what you should be seeing. So you've got about 50 to 60% of inorganic matter, and then you've got maybe about 20% air, 20% water, and about 5% organic matter. But the percentage of water and air changes all the time. So at this time of year, more of the pores will be full of water, and in the dry spells, more of the pores will be full of air. And you want to have that. Almost half the soil, about half the soil, should be full of water, air, and organic matter. In a poorly structured, dense, compacted soil, however, the pores might only be about 20% of soil volume. And when that happens, you will have problems. You'll get more flooding. You'll get roots not so able to move through the soil. These pores are vital for air supply to roots and all to the bugs that live in the soil of all sizes, drainage of excess water, water supply, water holding, and space for both organisms and roots to grow into. And that porosity is determined by soil structure. In other words, the way in which the inorganic particles, the sand, silt, clay, and organic matter, humus, combine to form aggregates. So what is good soil structure? Then it's lots of crumbs and fine blocky aggregates. So here's a picture of beautiful soil structure. One of the easiest ways to get a really nice picture of good soil structure is to go and look at long-term pasture soil, not a modern ryegrass dominated sward, but a species-rich sward where you've got a combination of some deeper rooted broadleaves, for example, in amongst grasses in long-term pasture, and look at a sward where there is where it's about the right pH and not too infertile, so it's got nutrients in it. That means that the organisms will be having a happy life and the plants should be growing well. That soil should be friable, crumbly, easy to dig. There should be deep, dense roots. The soil should have a roughish surface, not a capped, hard surface. Should be no signs of waterlogging. That structure forming is a natural process, but it is very much also influenced by management. The soil should also smell good. I mean, it's a really important thing. This doesn't work if you've not got a good sense of smell, but if you do, you can tell a great deal about how healthy a soil is from the smell. Poor structure, oh dear, well, there's 3 pictures of some pretty badly structured soils. So that one at the top right, there's a plough pan there, which is very, very heavy, and the water's just sitting on it. It's blue, which means bluish grey, which means the soil's anaerobic. It smelt very strongly of sulphur and rotten egg smell. Not a healthy soil. It's very compact. It's been over-cultivated and it's had too much livestock on it. The next one down's got a plough pan as well, which is preventing water and nutrients getting up and roots getting up and down. And then we see the same in the bottom one there. So we've got large, massive structure, large PEDs or huge solid aggregates with very few cracks and pores. We've got a coarse, blocky structure, or massive, which means hardly any drainage channels and pores at all. The soil's hard, it's hard to dig. The roots are shallow and few, and some grow sideways. Soil might have a smooth surface, a crusted, capped surface, which indicates there's no organic matter there sort of holding the aggregates together, and the aggregates just split and wash out. Soil might be waterlogged in wet period, and it quite often doesn't smell good. So what causes that poor structure? Well, here's some examples really. Harvesting of root crops in wet weather, and that was carrot harvesting above there. Carrots are often harvested in the wet when soil conditions are very far from being suitable. Heavy machinery, that's anaerobic digestate being applied with a modern trailing shoe spreader. Anaerobic digestion is great, and application of digestate can be good too, but under some circumstances with heavy tankers, it's not so great for the soil if it's being applied in wet conditions. Unfortunately, livestock as well. Pigs are a disaster for soil structure. Good for all sorts of other reasons, but pigs are ideally not going to be put on very wet land because they can cause a lot of damage. So over-cultivation, heavy machinery, natural pans as well. There's some soil types have natural pans. For example, the Countess Wells series of soils in Aberdeen. So there are some natural pans which can make it difficult for well-structured soils to form. Continuous cropping, monocropping, working in wet conditions or livestock movement in wet conditions, overgrazing, lack of organic matter returns, and wet weather can all make structural problems worse. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the things that you can do to improve soil structure and to improve soil health. Organic matter. I can't mention that often enough. It's vitally important for well-structured soils. It takes many forms as well. fresh organic matter, regular fresh organic matter returns are very, very important, because that is the food for microorganisms. I mean, I think most of you will understand that. Organic matter can also be much, much older. We quite often call it recalcitrant, or humus is the sort of end product of decomposition, if you like. And although that cannot be food for microorganisms, it can be a very good place for microorganisms to live, and also a good place for nutrients to be held, particularly in sandy soils, which are not very, sand's not very good at doing that by itself. So regular returns of fresh organic matter, really important to build and maintain good soil health. I would say most small scale growers are very much aware of that. Also, I'm going to speak briefly about the numbers of organisms and the diversity of organisms. Both of those things are important. So numbers is only one thing, because although I would say that microorganisms have many, many, many roles, and the soil organisms in general, including the large ones like earthworms, mites, springtails, they have lots of roles, but each individual species probably only has one role. So the diversity is important as the numbers are important. So 1 gram of healthy soil might contain about 10 billion bacteria, with hundreds, if not thousands, of different species. And maybe a couple of kilometers of fungal hyphae, and then some of the single-celled mobile organisms like amoebae and protozoans, things like that, paramecium. And then a kilogram of healthy soil would contain huge numbers of macro and mesofauna as well, things like springtails, mites, collembolans, tardigrades, and of course, earthworms. I've said that really. So soil microorganisms undertake many vital roles, but you need that diversity in order to get all those roles fulfilled. So they break down organic matter into simple nutrients for plant uptake. They detoxify waste materials, including pesticides, and they protect, or in some cases, unfortunately, attack our crops. But as I said before, these life forms are only present in sufficient numbers and diversity if your soil is healthy in terms of its physical and chemical environment as well. So for a healthy soil, to summarize, we need good soil structure, we need field drains working, we need pH on target. For most situations, you're looking between about around about 6.5, a bit less for some crops. The amount of crop available PK and magnesium, so phosphate, potash, and magnesium's got to be on target. Also reasonable trace element concentrations, good organic matter content, at least 3.5%, ideally more, and good functional populations of soil organisms of all types. Now, just before I move on, this photograph on the right is at a big conventional horticultural enterprise which produces field vegetables. And my goodness, they've changed their ways. They realize how bad some of their cultivation practices can be for soil health, and now they're including about a year, if not a bit more, of green manures. So you can see down below in that photograph how kind of structureless that soil is, but the aggregates are beginning to form. You can see them there on the bottom of the picture beginning to form. And the aggregates round about the clover and grass roots are now really beginning to form quite well. So that's less than a year old, that's probably 9 months old, and soil structure is naturally beginning to develop under that green manure crop. So it's more important than ever to recognise the importance of soil health, measure it, and actively manage it. So we've got to be able to measure soil health if we're going to be able to understand the effectiveness of our management. But how? So there's no single method useful on its own. I've been involved in several government-funded research projects and HDB-funded projects trying to develop a single soil health indicator to measure, and I don't believe it exists. We need to do several physical, chemical and biological methods in order to get a really good grip on the health of our soil. Some labs do offer what's called a soil health test suite, but that still involves you doing some measurements and also them doing several measurements and coming up with an index. And I don't like it. I don't like a single index. I think it can mask a lot of important points. So I'm going to go very quickly through the main soil assessment methods that you might use. So first of all, physical ones, then chemical, then biological. So physical assessment methods, the best one I know by far was developed by Bruce Ball at SAC. And you just take a big spade full of soil, you sort of cut round 3 sides of a spade, and then the 4th side of a spade, and ease a spade full of soil out and dump it into a tray or onto a tarp. And then you assess the strength of the aggregates and the way in which these aggregates are arranged and whether there's any compaction. And you can obtain a score at the end of it, with 1 being a good score for nice, soft, friable, well-structured soil, and 5 very compact and poor. It's an excellent method. It's a very useful field method for quick and easy soil structure assessment. And it's useful for long-term monitoring because you can keep your recorded scores and then do it again in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years and see whether you've got an improvement. Can't really say a lot more without showing it to you done in the field, which is what I normally do. And then in terms of chemical soil assessment methods, that's basically lab tests. Mainly I'm talking about soil pH, which has such a strong influence on nutrient interactions and release, root development, microbial activity, everything. And then also extractable phosphorus, potash, and magnesium. So those are the main ones. You might want to look at trace elements as well in some situations, but not normally. Other extremely important tests, of course, soil organic matter. There's various methods that you could use. The most commonly used method is what's called the loss and ignition method. That's just where the lab burns off the soil organic matter and measures the weight loss. It's a very, very useful indicator of organic matter reserves, and it gives an indication of how soils will behave under stress, such as dry conditions or wet conditions or traffic. It usually changes very slowly over the years. Then you've also got another organic matter property, which is called labile soil organic matter. That's now an available, affordable test. I've been banging on about this for years, and it changes much more rapidly. So if you measure that, it's liable to give you a good indication of how well your management regimes are working if you change something. The labile or freely available organic matter provides energy and nutrients for the soil organisms. So it's a useful thing to measure. And then we've got some biological soil assessment methods. Okay, well, I'm going to be honest here. I'm not really a fan. Well, I am a fan. I'm very much a fan, and I've spent money on these myself. But the problem is the proof of the value is so far kind of lacking. So some labs will measure microbial biomass, microorganism diversity, total bacteria, total fungi, active bacteria, active fungi, and different types of microorganisms. But it's very difficult to relate that to how productive your soil is going to be, and it's really quite expensive. It can be well over £100 per test. So I've done it for interest's sake, but I wouldn't recommend if you're growing crops for money rather than growing crops as a hobby, which is nowadays what I do, then it's probably not worth the money, although it's very exciting to see the results coming in. This is one of the best ways that you can very quickly assess how good your soil, how well your soil is doing. Counting earthworm numbers. You have to do it though.
This coin is a really enticing find.
You really, to count the earthworms and have meaningful results, you do have to do it quite often, and you also have to do it at similar moisture contents in the soil and similar times a year. But basically, more worms equals better soil health. You can count other things too, but that's really quite time consuming. The other thing, which is quite good fun, which I've done on a regular basis, is bury a set of, this became very, very a sort of viral trend on the internet for a while, burying a pair of underpants in the soil and then digging them up to see what they look like several weeks later. And the best example I think I've ever done here with that was burying, well, you've got to be careful the kind of underpants you use. They've got to be pure cotton, ideally white, and none of these ones with any kind of artificial man-made fabrics in them, and none of the ones with the silver threads in them, which stops them decomposing. So you've got to give the microorganisms the best chance. Bury a new pair of clean white cotton knickers vertically in the soil with a waistband about 1 centimetre below the soil surface, and then leave them in there for a few weeks or months and dig them up. So poor decomposition is poor soil health, and good decomposition equals good soil health. So I did this work on Maggie Sutherland's beautiful organic farm up at Doors on just near Inverness, and we buried them in our polytunnel, and it was a bit shocking actually. The pants came out 6 weeks later, and honestly, you could have washed them in the washing machine, put them back on. There was no holes, and so it's not correct to think all organic farms have wonderful healthy soils, because this wasn't a particularly great soil. And then you go into it a bit more deeply and think, well, it's massively cultivated and extra cultivated with rotavators. It's pushed very, very hard. And there's not much in the way of fertility building, soil resting crops in there. But then you look at Maggie Sutherland's outdoors areas, which of course she has a lot more of. And it was incredible. These plants were in the soil for only about 4 weeks. And she has the most incredibly microbially diverse soils. And she's doing all the right things. So resting the soil, grass clover lays, green manures, minimal cultivations, etc., etc. And you can just about smell and hear the soil life in that soil. So the underpants test is a bit of a laugh, really, rather than anything else. But it sure did show the difference between microbial diversity and in one soil versus in others. And there was the polytunnel that we did the test in just beside it. So geographically within about 20 meters of each other, but how very different those soils were. So in conclusion, measuring soil health is very complex. There's no single method that will give you a meaningful value or an index. Use a mixture of methods. A simple physical method, a few basic chemical tests, and 1 or 2 biological methods. And then add some of the novel methods if you've got the time and the money. But it is worth spending time and money getting good baseline data, and get some help with the interpretation if you need it. And to actually improve and maintain soil health, you really are having to look at a multi-point approach. And this is one of the most beautiful soils you would ever imagine, a long-term pasture soil here, crammed with earthworms, lots of roots right down to about ½ a metre deep, multiple aggregates, lots of pores and root channels in there. Most of the useful strategies to enhance and maintain soil health are all really aimed at one thing, and that is they're aimed at building and maintaining soil organic matter, because if you do that, there's a very good chance that soil structure is just going to get better and better over time. Our soils are massively lacking in organic matter in some parts of the country, but I would hope that on your holdings that won't be the case. So we've lost a lot of organic matter in only 15 years of really intensive agriculture, and that is beginning to turn around now. And where we put organic matter back after a spell of running it down, if you like, you will see improved structure in the soil, easier to work, increased water holding capacity, but also increased infiltration, so less flooding and ponding, increased biological activity, improved retention and turnover of nutrients, and also much better resilience, well, to both wet and dry conditions. So to summarize, ways. I would like to see what questions we've got now. I'm happy to answer questions on all of this, but the main ways to enhance and maintain soil health on small scale or large scale land holdings would be regular return of organic matter to the soil in the form of, in an ideal world, you would be wanting to apply bulky organic fertilizers in the form of things like composts, dungs, straw. Also return of crop residues where you can, haulms of peas and beans, straw of some of the crops that you're growing, not just cereal straw, but the bits that you don't harvest, chop them up and return them to soil. Green manures and cover crops, particularly important where you don't have enough bulky organic fertilizers or you don't have any animals. Wider rotations, so you're growing lots of a diversity of different crops, and perhaps break crops like grass clover lays, where you're not actually harvesting something and selling it for money, but you're investing in the soil by putting in a crop which has the sole aim of improving that soil. Green manures can be a form of break crop, of course. Using livestock in the rotation, more and more growers are bringing livestock back in where it wasn't there before, and that can be a very good thing. Reducing the tillage, because every time you cultivate, you're exposing organic matter to the air, and it will be oxidized, broken down, and lost. So try to reduce the amount of tillage that you do. I've put in at the end here, you do get some people believing that biostimulants will help to enhance and maintain soil health. I'm not really much of a fan. By that I mean a wide range of different products available on the open market. Now, some of them you might make yourself, like, for example, things like compost teas, nettle tea, comfrey tea. Some of these things are basically excellent. They can be good fertilizers as well as feeding some of the bugs. I'm not a great fan of some of the bought things. I better not name names, but some of the ones that you can buy in the open market, some of the seaweed extracts are very good, and that has been proven to have an effect. But some of the other ones, like humic acid, fulvic acid, not a great fan of some of these things. They can be quite expensive, and I think there's better ways to get the same results for a lot less money. But that's about all I'm going to say for now.